Thank you, Lara, for sitting down with me.
Of course.
We're here at Warwick.
Yep.
At the ASME conference.
Having a good time.
Having a good time. So what does it mean to go to conferences and congresses for you?
For me, a conference is all about connecting with community. I think one of the things that's interesting about medical education is that the world is small.
Yeah.
We're not a big community. In many individual centers, there's not always very many of us. So it can start to feel lonely in your individual space. But when you come to a conference like ASME, suddenly you're reminded these are my people.
Oh.
So coming, it's a little bit like coming home.
That's good. That's good. So why do you podcast?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know why.
I started off with the hard one.
No, that's okay. Why do I podcast? Honestly, a central reason I podcast is because I know, as I said, I know that there are a lot of people in spaces where there is one person who focuses on medical education, and that's them. And I know when you're in those kinds of spaces, I was in one of those once, it's really hard to make connections. It's really hard to pursue professional development, to find good resources, because it's all dependent upon you. And so I happen to be fortunate enough to be in a space where I have more community members and I have more support and a little more time than a lot of people. So then I feel that I have a responsibility to help participate and try to grow resources or be part of that growth, so that people who are perhaps an N of one in their space can be part of a conversation, then can be part of what's ongoing. And of course they can do that independently. But doing a podcast is a little bit more. It's easy access. They can listen to it while doing various things. We know that people listen while they're on their rowing machine, or while they're doing laundry, or while they're sitting beside their children holding hands while their child falls asleep. Wow, that's kind of amazing, right?
Yeah.
So if I can help be part of that kind of resource, then yeah, then that's why I do it. That's
Excellent.
good. Yeah.
Sometimes I'm thinking about the paper as a researcher. You publish a paper,
Yeah.
and then it's not the end of the story.
Right.
And the podcast is kind of the starting of something else.
I agree.
If we look at the podcast in the same way,
Yeah.
so how would you wish? I mean, we have a paper, we have a publishing of a podcast episode, and then what?
Oh, that's a great question, right? Because I really do feel that the way in which people are learning and getting resources and working in academia is changing. Once upon a time, publishing a paper in an academic journal was the end point. That was the goal. You published your findings, you're done. And the world is shifting. The world is moving. And journals don't act as places where people go to get the information, sit down and read the paper. They want those resources in different formats and in different ways. And so the podcast is an opportunity for us to highlight some findings, some research, to talk about it, to discuss the things that we think are really excellent, some places where there might be areas for improvement, and also to do little pieces of education around, well, they did this interesting thing with saturation or whatever. But then there should be more. Then there really should. Wouldn't it be great if we started to think about all of the different ways in which we could make accessing and using this information, dropping the threshold lower? Like going from an accessing journal to a podcast, reading the paper to listening to the podcast, we just dropped how much work it is to get in. How could we drop it again? How could we make it easier to get in? What's the whole ecology of genres of communication that we could harness, that academia has ignored largely? Things like blogs make a lot of sense. But what could we do on a YouTube short? I have no idea. But boy, I think that'd be fun to find out, right? Like, I barely know what a YouTube short is, but I know it's short. What other resources, what other things are being generated that we could tap into and start to think differently about what it means to disseminate our findings? I think that's exciting.
What is a good paper and what is a good paper for the podcast? Because that could be two different things.
Oh, for sure, totally. So for me as a researcher, as a scholar, when I'm at my desk, a good paper is one that has clear insights, that is rigorous, because that's the first section I always read, and also that ties into the broad conversation, so that I can see how this is a piece of an ongoing conversation of ideas and ways of thinking. That, for me, is a good paper. Those aren't always good papers for the podcast. Sometimes the best papers for the podcast are the ones I really disagree with, or the ones where they may not have the best writing or whatever for different parts, but they had a clever little thing they did in this piece. Because then I can highlight different pieces of, like, whatever they did in the rest of the paper, fine. But let's look at this. Because it enables me to, if I can find papers that have little gems like that, then I'm excited. And once upon a time, not that long ago, we did a podcast where I essentially, truly only wanted to talk about Appendix 3. Because it was a great appendix that everybody should read when you need to write your ethics statement in your manuscript. So the paper was fine, but Appendix 3 is like gorge. So yeah, good papers are sometimes little things.
So a good paper for the podcast could be a paper that kind of stir up the right kind of discussion?
Absolutely, yeah. And it could be any kind of discussion. Either they're doing something really great or they're making me ask questions I didn't want to ask and I'm uncomfortable. All of them are great, yeah.
So what would you like to say to the authors of the papers that you actually have picked?
So what I would like to say to those authors is that, first and foremost, thank you. Thank you for writing your paper. Thank you for taking the time to be so excellent and to put your ideas out there. It is such a gift that they give. The second thing I want to tell them is that the scales mean nothing, no matter what anybody says. So, you know, we review them, and so that means that we offer pros, we offer cons, we offer reflections, and I hope they know that we by no means want to disrespect their work. In fact, the fact that we picked their work says to us, I hope it says to them that we picked it because we saw something in there that was important to talk about and something that we wanted to highlight and get into. And so we owe them a debt of gratitude. I also hope those authors will write more and then write back to us. Talk to us, get in a conversation with us, send us an audio memo, and we'll respond. And then that would be another way of dropping engagement, of making it easier to get into this conversation. So I hope they write back. Yeah.
And what would you say to our listeners?
Thank you. Thank you for letting us into your home. Thank you for letting us in between your ears. Thank you for thinking this was worthwhile, because it's a lot of fun for us. We enjoy it a lot. And what I would also say to our listeners is that this is as much, I hope for them, a place of growth. I would love for our listeners to have ideas for how we could do better, have ideas about segments they'd like to hear, have ideas about things that, you know, Simon Fleming once said to me, and he might have gotten it from somebody else, that feedback is the breakfast of champions. And I buy into that. That is so true. So I would love their feedback, because this doesn't get better unless they tell us how. Yeah.
So there's one thing you are curious about when it comes to our listeners?
I would be really curious to know what they need. What would be more useful? What are the segments that you really find like, oh, like that was useful, or segments that maybe they find not as useful? Because that helps us to evolve the platform, the podcast, into something that's an even better resource for the community. Because at the end of the day, this podcast is only worth doing if it's helpful, if it's useful, if it's all those sorts of things. Yes, we do it for the joy of our relationship, but we can have a relationship without the podcast. This podcast is really about creating a resource that the community sees as important and valuable.
What aspect would you like to put a light on when it comes to human dimensions?
If I could put one highlight on the idea of human dimensions, I would put a highlight on the idea that each one of us is so unique. Each one of us has different quirks and quirks that make us who we are, be it physical abilities or lack thereof, be it various social, demographic, or racial, religion, rural, urban. We are all an incredibly unique set of circumstances. And so the human dimension of education in my mind is the art of meeting people, each one of our learners, where they are, and then helping them to grow. And that is hard. That is hard work, because it is much easier to say, well, on average, we're here, so this is where we'll start. It's a very different attitude to say, I'm going to meet each of you where you are. And I think that that is what I would love to see.
Thank you, Lara. My pleasure.
Are we done?